Hi class, today we are going to be looking at something that should be pretty familiar to you all, types of diffusion for our Unit 3 on culture. So we're going to be talking about diffusion, but within this context. So one of the underlying themes of this entire unit is that the interaction of people contributes to the spread of cultural practices. And of course, we are going to be talking about that through types of diffusion. We are going to be focusing on relocation and expansion. And remember, expansion includes contagious, hierarchical, and stimulus for the types of diffusion. So a lot of this should be recap. For instance, cultural hearth. This is where an origin of some sort of cultural trait begins and from which it diffuses. So some ancient examples of cultural hearths we can see over here on the side of the screen. And for instance, we have Mesopotamia, the first civilization. And then from there, we saw different ideas and technologies and cultural elements move outward. As well as many of these other ancient cultural hearths. Some modern cultural hearths include some of the major cities in the world, for instance, New York or Paris, as a place where certain cultural trends begin and then from there move outward. So for diffusion, this is the movement or spread of cultural traits, knowledge, ideas, trends from hearths to other geographic areas. So as mentioned, these are the two categories, relocation, which is a category of its own, and then expansion. So for relocation, it is exactly how that term sounds. It's the spread of a cultural trait through the migration of people or through the relocation of people. So once people move from one place to another place, they take with them their culture, their language, their traditions, their belief systems. And because of that, we see those cultural traits diffuse. So looking at an example, the migration of Europeans to the Americas during colonization resulted in Christianity spreading to the other side of the world, as well as different European languages, namely Spanish and English. All right, so for expansion diffusion. So expansion diffusion, this is just that general idea that a cultural trait will spread through the interaction between other people and will move outward from that hearth. Okay, so within expansion diffusion, we have contagious, hierarchical, and stimulus diffusion, all of which we've touched on in Unit 1. One thing we are going to add in this chapter is reverse hierarchical diffusion. So for contagious diffusion, think of something like a cold. It's something that spreads rapidly, widely, and continuously from the hearth to others who are in close contact with that particular trait. Keep in mind this idea of time-space compression also adds to that idea where because of globalization and our communication technologies like the internet and smartphones, we see contagious diffusion at a global level, right? Through things like viral videos and memes and so on. Then we have hierarchical diffusion. So this spreads in a hierarchy. Typically, we see these traits pass from the most interconnected or maybe powerful people or maybe wealthy people in certain organizations and then down to others. We can also think of it as first people who are most susceptible to adopting a particular trait, and then eventually it spreads to the general public. This could be restrictive due to cost or access or interest as well. So some examples, cell phones were first only owned by wealthy elites in large cities. This was like cutting edge technology, believe it or not, at one time. And then eventually once they became mass produced, they spread to a wider market. Once things get mass produced, then the cost tends to decrease. Also, different things like pop culture trends, music, fashion can also spread via hierarchical diffusion. So now for reverse hierarchical diffusion. So these are the spread of cultural traits beginning with the least interconnected or with the least wealthy or powerful people and organizations, and then eventually work their way like up the hierarchy. So for these, think of like niche groups that maybe are not as well known or in the public eye. So, for instance, hip hop music in the US typically started in centers with large amounts of poverty or discrimination. If we think about some of the early hip hop music, we see certain trends and themes that deal with poverty and discrimination, or the African American experience. Now we have such a broad range of hip hop music because it spread from that smaller culture and then eventually out to middle class and even like wealthy people enjoy hip hop music. Also, Walmart is another example. Initially, it began in a small town, and now it is an international company. Stimulus diffusion. This is the next type of diffusion we're going to go over. So these are traits that are altered or modified as they spread from one place to another place. And this could be because of many different things, sometimes a cultural barrier or a taboo, or just a cultural difference. So a trait will be introduced into a new population, and that population will like that trait, at least in part. So then they adopt it, but they adapt it. They'll change it a little bit that suits themselves the best. So for examples, some examples would be in India, we have a lot of practicing Hindus that do not eat any animal protein. They're vegetarian. So because of that, McDonald's offers a wider variety of different veggie burgers and other menu items. So just a little recap, make sure you know the different types of diffusion, make sure you can think of examples and situations where we might use them